The sun cast a golden hue over Willow Creek Estates, that kind of warm suburban glow you see in real estate brochures promising peace and perfection. White picket fences framed manicured lawns, and children's laughter occasionally echoed from tidy backyards. To the outsider, it was paradise. But I knew better. Behind the trimmed hedges and neighborhood watch signs lay something darker, something that had been growing like a weed beneath the roses. I had moved here with my daughter Ellie after my wife passed. She was only 9 then, and though life had been cruel, her spirit never broke. Ellie was born with a rare spinal condition that confined her to a wheelchair, but it never stopped her from smiling or finding beauty in things most people overlooked. I installed a ramp in front of our modest 2-story home, painted it a soft blue to match her favorite color, and filled the porch with potted sunflowers. For Ellie, it was home. For others, it was apparently an eyesore. Karen Wilkins, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, had been circling our house like a vulture ever since we moved in. Her polite smiles masked the venom she carried behind her eyes. Her newsletters, dropped weekly in every mailbox like scripture, always seemed to contain some veiled dig at violations and non-compliance. I didn't have the energy to play her games. Being the sheriff of this town demanded enough of my attention, and I figured if I ignored her long enough, she'd find someone else to hound. But she didn't. In fact, she got worse. It started with letters, then phone calls, then citations. She claimed the ramp was too visually disruptive, that the flower pots were clutter, that the dog Ellie depended on for comfort and safety was a disturbance. Each time I kept my cool. I wore the badge after all. I knew the law and I knew my rights. But there's something you can't prepare for, even as a sheriff. You can't predict the moment when someone's hidden cruelty decides to bare its teeth. I just never imagined it would come so close to home, or that it would draw blood. Karen Wilkins didn't just run the HOA. She ruled it like a personal kingdom. With her helmet of stiff blonde hair and perfectly pressed blazers, she strutted through the neighborhood like she owned every square foot of pavement. She lived 2 houses down from us in a pristine colonial, with a white stone pathway she bragged was imported from Italy. Every morning she marched around with her clipboard, taking notes like a prison warden doing head counts. Neighbors waved out of forced politeness. Some smiled. Most looked away. Everyone feared the consequences of drawing her attention. She had an eye for weakness, a hunger for control, and a nose for anything that didn't meet her aesthetic standards. It wasn't enough that your grass was green. It had to be the exact height approved in the HOA handbook. Window shutters had to be taupe, not beige. Trash cans must be stored in the garage by 6 p.m. sharp. She'd fined the Johnsons for planting marigolds instead of tulips, and tried to get the Harris family evicted for putting up a pride flag during June. But with us, her obsession became personal. From the moment Ellie and I arrived, Karen treated us like a threat to her imagined order. She called our ramp an architectural disruption, never mind the ADA compliance. The first week she knocked on our door with a friendly smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "I hope your daughter doesn't expect special treatment here just because she's, in that chair." I closed the door in her face before I said something I couldn't take back. But she didn't stop. She left notes about Ellie's therapy sessions being too loud, even though they were indoors and silent, except for the occasional laughter. She complained about the color of Ellie's wheelchair, said the pink paint clashed with the neighborhood palette. One time, when Ellie was chalking happy drawings on the sidewalk, Karen stood over her and told her she was polluting the environment. I wasn't home, and my daughter didn't tell me until days later. Karen's brand of prejudice was always wrapped in protocol, in rules and guidelines, in quotes from a handbook she treated like gospel. But beneath the formalities, it was clear. She saw Ellie's disability not just as an inconvenience, but as an imperfection that dared to exist where she demanded uniformity. She hated the things she couldn't control, and what she couldn't erase with letters or warnings, she was willing to destroy with her own hands. It was a Saturday morning when the spark was struck. The sky was cloudless, and Ellie had been in a particularly good mood. She'd just finished one of her online art classes and was excited to try something new, painting flowers on the sides of her wheelchair ramp. I watched from the kitchen window as she dipped her brush into pinks and purples, humming softly to herself, while our golden retriever, Max, lay at her side like a fluffy sentinel. The mural was nothing dramatic, just soft looping petals, vines climbing gently up the wood. She had a way of making things come alive with color, of turning bare surfaces into joy. By the time I stepped outside to bring her some lemonade, half the ramp looked like a blooming garden. She beamed up at me, her cheeks smudged with paint. "Do you like it, Dad?" she asked. I smiled and kissed the top of her head. "I love it, sweetheart. It's perfect." But perfection, it seemed, had a different definition for Karen Wilkins. She showed up that afternoon, marching across our lawn as if the grass itself had offended her. Clipboard in one hand, a red folder in the other. I opened the door before she could knock. Her lips were pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared into her face. "I noticed an unauthorized alteration to the front structure," she said, voice clipped like a blade. "You didn't submit a design change request to the board. This is a clear violation." "It's paint, Karen," I said, already tired. "My daughter decorated her ramp. She's a kid." "It's graffiti," she snapped, "and it lowers property values. This is a family neighborhood, not a circus." Ellie heard her from the porch and tried to explain. "I just wanted to make it pretty." Karen turned to her with a look I'll never forget. Cold, dismissive. "That ramp is already an eyesore. Now you've made it worse." I stepped between them before she could say more. "You're done here," I said, keeping my voice steady. "This conversation is over." Karen left, but not before dropping the red folder on our porch. Inside was a violation notice, a threat of daily fines and a warning of legal action. I should have known then. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of calm that stretches thin like glass right before it shatters. I was called out on a service run across town, a fender bender near the highway. Routine stuff. Ellie had just gotten home from school and was sitting out front with Max, brushing his fur in the warm light. I remember thinking before I left how peaceful she looked, how proud I was that she'd found joy again in small things. I wasn't gone for more than an hour, but it was enough. Karen came unannounced. She must have waited, watched, known I wasn't home. Witnesses later told me she marched right up our driveway with that same folder in hand, eyes sharp with that entitled fury she wore like perfume. Max barked once, then again, more urgently. But Karen didn't flinch. Ellie, never expecting danger in her own front yard, smiled politely at first. "Hi, Mrs. Wilkins." "I warned you," Karen said, her voice loud, clipped, trembling with something dark. "You've disrespected every rule we live by. That ramp, that paint, this filth you call decoration." Ellie's hand, still holding a paintbrush, trembled. "My dad said I could." "You people always think you're above rules," Karen hissed, stepping closer. "Just because your daddy wears a badge doesn't mean you get special treatment." Max growled, low and protective. Ellie reached to calm him, but in that moment Karen reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a small kitchen knife. She pointed it at the painted ramp, then at Ellie. "I told you to clean it up. I told you this neighborhood has standards." What happened next wasn't just madness, it was evil in motion. Karen raised the knife and lunged, not at the ramp, but at my daughter. The blade sliced across Ellie's side, a shallow but vicious cut just beneath her ribs. She screamed and Max lunged, barking and snapping. Neighbors burst from their houses, rushing to the scene. One of them tackled Karen. Another dialed 911. And Ellie, God, my Ellie, was curled in her wheelchair, blood soaking her shirt, her face pale with shock. I was still 5 minutes out when I got the dispatch. Possible stabbing, juvenile victim. Location, Willow Creek Estates. My heart dropped into my stomach. When the address was confirmed, my address, I floored the gas pedal. I don't remember the drive, just the blur of lights, the weight of dread pressing harder with each second. By the time I arrived, paramedics were lifting Ellie onto a stretcher. Her eyes met mine, full of pain and fear, but she managed a whisper. "Daddy." Karen was on the ground in handcuffs, restrained by 2 neighbors and a young officer who looked stunned by what he'd just witnessed. The knife had been tossed aside, its blade streaked with blood and specks of pink paint. The world tilted. Rage, grief, disbelief, all of it roared through me. My little girl had been attacked in the one place she was supposed to be safe, all because of some twisted obsession with control. Karen thought she could cut into our lives like we were nothing. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The radio crackled just as I was filling out paperwork from the accident report. Unit 2-7. Respond to a possible assault at Willow Creek Estates. Juvenile victim. Medical is en route. I barely registered the words before the address hit me like a punch to the chest. My address. My pen dropped. My heart slammed into my ribs. I snatched the mic. "Dispatch, confirm the location." "Confirmed. 419 Elm Hollow Lane." I didn't say another word. Lights on, sirens screaming. I tore out of that parking lot like a bat out of hell. Every second felt like an eternity clawing at my chest. I gripped the wheel with white knuckles, every thought screaming the same name. Ellie. I'd been to hundreds of scenes. Domestic violence, break-ins, bar fights, worse. But never once had I felt what I felt in that moment. Pure, undiluted terror. Not the kind that freezes you. The kind that ignites you. The kind that makes time slow down and your blood burn. When I turned onto Elm Hollow, I saw the crowd before I saw her. Neighbors gathered in clusters on the lawn. Flashing red lights reflected off vinyl siding. My house, our home, was ringed by chaos. I jumped out before the cruiser even stopped rolling. A medic saw me coming and pointed toward the stretcher. "Sheriff, your daughter, she's stable, but..." I rushed forward, and there she was, Ellie, my baby, lying on the stretcher, pale and trembling, blood staining her shirt, her eyes locked onto mine, wide and wet with tears. I reached for her hand. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." "She hurt me," she whispered, voice thin and broken. She just got so mad." I didn't need her to say who. I already knew. I turned, and that's when I saw Karen Wilkins, sitting on the curb in handcuffs, guarded by a young officer. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her face contorted into something between confusion and fear. She hadn't realized who Ellie was. She hadn't realized who I was. She stood when she saw me. "Sheriff, wait, But I raised a hand, not out of mercy, out of restraint, because at that moment, the only thing keeping me from losing control was the hand of my wounded daughter wrapped around mine. Karen tried to speak again as I approached, but I didn't give her the chance. I took the cuffs from the young officer, who stepped aside with a look that said everything: shock, disgust, sympathy. Karen's mouth moved, grasping for words, for excuses, for anything that could shift the blame away from what she'd done. "Sheriff, this isn't what it looks like," she said quickly. "I was trying to protect the neighborhood. She provoked me. That child was aggressive. I stared at her, my face unreadable, but inside I was a storm. Her voice, so smug, so desperate now, scraped at every nerve. I thought of Ellie's smile, her soft hands covered in paint, the way she cried when she saw blood on her shirt. I thought of the fear in her voice when she said, "She hurt me." "You assaulted my daughter with a weapon," I said, voice low but trembling with controlled fury. "You approached a minor, unsupervised on private property with a knife. Do you understand what that means?" Karen's expression faltered. I didn't mean to hurt her. It was just supposed to scare her a little, get her to stop. To stop what? Existing? Living in her own home? Painting flowers? I took a step closer, holding up the stained knife that had been bagged for evidence. "You brought this into my yard. You raised this at a disabled child and left a wound she'll carry long after her body heals." Karen's knees buckled slightly. "I didn't know she was yours. I didn't know you lived." "And that makes it worse," I snapped. "You thought she was nobody. You thought there'd be no consequences." I turned her around, tightening the cuffs just enough to make her flinch. She gasped, finally realizing she wasn't going to talk her way out of this. I read her rights aloud, each word deliberate, measured, like stones dropped into a quiet lake. The same words I'd said to 100 other criminals. But this time, every syllable had weight. Karen whimpered as I guided her toward the patrol car. The crowd of neighbors parted silently, watching her go with a mix of horror and grim satisfaction. Some of them had been afraid of her. Some had even admired her. But today, they saw her for what she truly was. I looked back once more toward the house. The ambulance doors had just closed. Ellie was inside, heading for the hospital. And I swore, right then and there, that Karen Wilkins would never hurt anyone again. The hospital smelled like bleach and fear. Ellie lay in the bed, IV in her arm, a white bandage wrapped around her ribs. Her eyes fluttered open when I walked in, and even through the painkillers she smiled. That smile nearly broke me. I sat by her side and held her hand, careful not to squeeze too tight, careful not to let her see the storm still raging behind my eyes. The doctor said the wound wasn't deep, but it would scar. A thin line, just under her ribs. She'd carry it with her, like a mark left behind by hatred, pretending to be order. Emotionally, the damage ran deeper. Ellie was quieter now, her eyes always watching the door. Her voice, once bubbling with wonder, had dulled into soft, cautious tones. I stayed by her side for days. The community came. Neighbors brought flowers and cards, homemade meals and hand-drawn notes from their children. One old couple down the street offered to repaint the ramp themselves. For the first time, people saw past the lawns and fences and realized what we'd been enduring, what Ellie had been enduring. Karen Wilkins was denied bail. The evidence was clear, the witness accounts damning. She faced charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, child endangerment, and trespassing. Her smug confidence cracked the moment she stood in court in a beige jumpsuit, wrists bound in cuffs, eyes scanning the courtroom for sympathy that never came. The HOA board scrambled. Several members resigned in shame. The rest held an emergency vote to strip Karen of her title and dissolve the existing policies that gave her unchecked power. A new board was formed, one with actual compassion and common sense. It was long overdue. I returned to work after Ellie was discharged, but something had shifted. I wasn't just the sheriff anymore. I was the father of a girl who had been targeted in her own home, and I was done playing polite with people who used rules as weapons. Ellie eventually painted over the blood-stained section of the ramp, not with flowers this time, but with a single bright yellow sun. She said it made her feel safe, and I told her that as long as I was breathing, no one would ever dim her light again. The courtroom was packed the day Karen's trial began. News had spread beyond our quiet suburb, drawing in reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. But for me, it was personal. I sat with Ellie beside me, her hand in mine, as we watched Karen Wilkins walk in, wearing the same smug expression she always had, though now it trembled at the edges. She avoided our eyes. The prosecution built its case around facts so clear they didn't need embellishment. The knife, the blood, the testimonies from neighbors who'd seen it all. But what hit hardest was Ellie's quiet voice on the stand. She wore a yellow ribbon in her hair, the same color she'd painted on the ramp, and spoke with soft resolve. When asked how she felt that day, she said, "I was scared she hated me for being different." That silenced the room more than any objection ever could. Karen's lawyer tried every tired defense, stress, miscommunication, even blaming the HOA's pressure to maintain appearances. But none of it worked. The jury saw through it. They saw what we had lived with. A woman who used her position not to serve, but to dominate. When the guilty verdict was read, there was no applause, just a long, collective exhale. Karen was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with no chance of parole for the first 4. The judge called her actions a vile abuse of power against a defenseless child. For the first time, Karen didn't speak. She just stared straight ahead, blank and pale. Back in Willow Creek Estates, things changed. The HOA was restructured entirely. The old board disbanded, and a new charter was written with community input. The new leadership banned discriminatory fines and required all board actions to be transparent and publicly voted on. Ramps, murals, accessibility modifications, none of them would ever be challenged again. Ellie's story sparked something in people. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began speaking up. Ramps appeared where there were none before. A little girl down the street asked if she could paint stars on hers, just like Ellie's son. Our yard became a symbol, not of pity, but of pride. And while scars remain, so does strength. Justice had been served, but more importantly, change had taken root. The sun was setting behind the trees as Ellie dipped her brush into a soft gold and painted the final stroke of her mural. The ramp now stretched like a ribbon of light across our front porch, covered in suns, stars, and wildflowers, her universe blooming in color. Max lay beside her, tail thumping gently, and I stood by the steps, watching the girl who'd turned pain into art. She still wore a small bandage under her shirt, but the wound had begun to heal. The scar would stay, of course, but Ellie didn't hide from it. One day she asked me if it made her look brave. I told her it didn't have to. It proved she was. Neighbors passed by more often now, waving, stopping to chat, offering compliments not just out of courtesy but connection. Something had shifted. Fear had loosened its grip on our street. Control no longer wore the face of cruelty, and where once there had been silence, now there was laughter, music, even sidewalk chalk drawings that Ellie's friends added beside her ramp. I sometimes replay that day in my head, the call, the blood, the fury I'd buried to do my duty. Part of me will never forgive myself for not being home. But the bigger part knows this. I showed up when it mattered, and I made sure justice didn't look away. As the last light faded and Ellie leaned back, admiring her work, I knelt beside her and rested a hand on her shoulder. She smiled up at me, tired but proud. "You did good, kiddo," I said. "So did you," she replied. In that quiet moment, I made a vow, not just as a sheriff, but as a father. No one would ever hurt her again. Not while I drew breath. Not ever.